Welcome everybody to the Atheist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller. I'm hosting the session. This session is being held in conjunction with the Progressive Atheists, and we're on the platform of the Existentialist Society and their Zoom facility. Now, today's speaker is David Rand from the Atheist Freethinkers in Montreal, Canada. And his topic is Stillbirth, the failure of secularism in the English-speaking world. And before I hand over to David, could I please ask everybody to mute your microphones so that won't be any interference while David's giving his presentation. And following his presentation, there'll be ample opportunity for questions, comments, and discussion. David.
Thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now. I have a slide presentation. Okay, there we go. David, can you see the first slide with the title?
Yes, yes.
Very good. As David has indicated, I'm with an organization in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada, called Atheist Freethinkers. The theme of my talk will be a comparison of secularism in English and French models, two different currents of thought within secularism. And what I talk about will be based mainly on my book, which is entitled Stillbirth, The Failure of Secularism in the English-Speaking World. And since I'm talking to people mainly in Australia, I should mention that in my book, I deal mainly with the core countries, USA, Great Britain, France, and Canada, and a little bit of Switzerland. But I do not deal at all with Australia, New Zealand, and other Anglophone countries. So I thought I should mention that since, since you're in Australia, or the majority of people here in Australia. My goal is to explain fundamental differences between the two models of secularism in the two groups of countries. So I deal with the core countries. First of all, what is secularism? What conditions must be met? And here are a few criteria that can be used. The laws of people should take precedence over the laws of so-called gods if we want a secular regime, and real world considerations should take precedence over other worldly concerns, over religious obligations, for example. In fact, I would say there's no such thing as a religious obligation. Religious obligations are just an obligation imposed, a constraint imposed by some other human beings, some religious authorities. It's not all religion is human, so an obligation is just imposed by some authority. And our common humanity should take precedence over our particular identities, whether those identities are racial or religious or sexual orientation or sex or whatever. And that's called universalism. Now, if we go back to a little bit of history, a major figure in the history of secularism in the English-speaking world is the 17th century philosopher John Locke. And he published a letter concerning toleration in 1689, where he proposed a society and a government which tolerated various religions. However, he excluded those religions which failed to tolerate others, which for him included Catholics, because he assumed Catholics would be loyal to a foreign prince, the Pope. And he was also very prejudiced against atheists. He claimed that atheists could not be trusted. Like an oath given by an atheist is worthless, in his opinion. So his religious tolerance was rather limited. Basically, his point of view is limited to weak religious neutrality. By weak neutrality, I mean neutrality between different religions, whereas strong neutrality would be when you include the non-religious and you have equality between the religious and the non-religious as well. But obviously, he recognized only the religious as being worthy of toleration, because anybody without a religion is like beyond the pale, in his opinion. If we fast forward a little bit, by about a century, the US Constitution made some significant progress in a direction of secularism. There's Article 6, which says that no religious test shall ever be required to hold public office. So right away, we have some toleration of atheists that Locke did not do. So that's important progress. And there's the famous First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. However, the limitation of this First Amendment has to be underlined. There is no separation in this First Amendment. The word separation or anything meaning separation doesn't appear in the First Amendment, and I don't think it appears anywhere else in the US Constitution, as far as I can tell. Also, but all it does is impose a degree of neutrality. That is, it makes it illegal to establish state religion. However, the second clause here is rather problematic. Prohibiting the free, you cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. Well, that's all very well. It sounds good, but it's absolutist. There's no limitation placed on it. And currently, with the Supreme Court appointments done by Donald Trump, the interpretation of that is to give total, absolute freedom to religious exercise, including the freedom to discriminate, which is very backward. And I should also point out that these two provisions applied only to the federal government in the United States and not to state governments until the 20th century, when certain Supreme Court decisions extended them to state governments. So they were quite limited. Now, meanwhile, a little later in Great Britain, the term secularism was coined in the English language by George Jacob Holyoake. He interpreted it as more as a personal stance, whereas I would consider secularism as more. It's a principle of governments. I would say that governments or states are secular, not people. But he interpreted it more personally. He was a major figure in the free thought movement in England in the 19th century. He was also prejudiced against atheists. He tended to see atheism as a belief system on symmetrical with theism, which is an irrational point of view. I mean, of course, atheism is not a belief system. It's a rejection of unsubstantiated belief. But that was Holyoake's approach. He wasn't as atheophobic as Locke, I don't think. And he was a colleague of Charles Bradlaugh, who, contrary to Holyoake, was an unabashed atheist. In fact, Bradlaugh stated that morality is impossible without atheism. You need to be an atheist to have a reasonable set of morals. For example, he said in his plea for atheism, atheism would preserve man from lying, stealing, murdering now, not from fear of an eternal agony after death, but because those crimes make this life itself a course of misery. Now, in the French-speaking world, the French Revolution made major progress towards secularism, although a lot of that was turned back, and then there was a lot of back and forth over the 19th century. But in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen established that the citizenry make laws, not gods, and nobody should be disturbed because of their opinions, even religious. So it implemented religious freedom. There was also a Declaration of Rights of Women and Female Citizens, authored by Olympe de Gouges, who's pictured here. That was proposed. Unfortunately, it was not adopted at the time. And in 1795, a few years after the beginning of the revolution, the legislature, the convention, decreed an end to all financial support for religion, an excellent progress for secularism. But a few years later, Napoleon, coup d'etat, he took power as emperor. He had an agreement with the Pope, and he restored state funding of religion. Eventually, that state funding was extended. It started with Roman Catholicism, and it was extended to Protestants and Jews. And so at least the old religious intolerance of the old monarchy was not restored. There was certainly he destroyed secularism, but at least he didn't restore the old highly theocratic regime. Now, like the English word secularism, the French word laïcité was coined in the 19th century. It's derived from the ancient Greek laos, meaning the common people. So we see a universalist orientation right here in the coining of the term. I translate that into English as Republican secularism to distinguish it from weaker versions of secularism. And in 1905, the French government passed legislation, which is probably the most important secular legislation ever adopted anywhere, the law of separation between churches and state. It repealed the Napoleonic Concordant, except in a certain region which was part of Germany at the time and was conquered back by France in the First World War. And that's stayed an anomaly ever since. It's a part of France to which the law of 1905 does not apply, unfortunately. And that law assured freedom of conscience. Freedom of religion is never mentioned. It's a free exercise of worship is mentioned, but freedom of religion is not mentioned, which is fine because freedom of religious belief is included in freedom of conscience, which also includes its freedom from religion, from religious beliefs. So freedom of conscience is the best thing to use, I think. And it cut off funding to churches, which is excellent. Now, if we compare the models of secularism which tend to prevail in the English-speaking world compared to the French-speaking world, in the English-speaking world, the separation principle is not respected. Thomas Jefferson talked about a wall of separation, and I think that's what he wanted, but it's not written into law in any legislation in the English-speaking world that I'm familiar with, and not in the U.S. Constitution, for example. Religion tends to get privileged over political or philosophical opinions. Universalism is not totally respected, and the mentality tends to be Lockean. That is, a weak religious neutrality. Freedom of religion is given priority. Neutrality among various religions, but not necessarily neutrality between believers and non-believers, which is necessary for full secularism. In the French-speaking world, the separation principle is explicit, at least in the 1905 law, in the very title of the law. Religion tends to be seen on a par with political and philosophical convictions, not as privileged. Universalism is better respected, and freedom of conscience is the basic freedom that's guaranteed. And that includes, as I said, both belief and non-belief, and freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, freedom of apostasy, for example, to change a religion. And another thing which is very important is that in French law, the freedoms are recognized as not being absolute. And this is very important because as a general rule, freedoms should not be absolute, because they sooner or later, they bump up against somebody else's freedom or some other kind of freedom. So there needs to be equilibrium between freedoms. Now, I want to talk about the issue of banning religious symbols worn by civil servants. This is necessary. Well, the civil service, the state institution should be free of religious symbols for secularism. That includes any symbols displayed on the installations, like on the walls, for example, but also it includes symbols worn by civil servants while they're working. Otherwise, it's a violation of both religious neutrality and the separation principle. Such bans prevent proselytism, and it's important to recognize that proselytism doesn't just mean trying to convert somebody to another religion. It means trying to normalize your brand. I don't know if you have ads on Australian television like we do in Canada for Amazon, for example, where it shows an Amazon employee, and the aim of the ad is to convince you that Amazon is a good corporate citizen and it's a wonderful place to work. So they're not selling a product other than the company itself. Well, that's what religious proselytism is often about. If they convert somebody, that's icing on the cake. The main thing is to normalize. For example, the hijab is used by political Islam to promote its brand and to get people used to seeing Islamist symbols everywhere, and so that people will accept it. And we shouldn't. Banning religious symbols worn by civil servants is a question of professional ethics. It is unprofessional to wear a partisan symbol, religious or political or otherwise. By the way, on the right side of this slide, there's a few religious symbols, and there's one political one that I've thrown in there, and you will easily recognize. The law of the land has to take precedence in state institutions over religious rules. So that's another reason to ban religious symbols. It restrains the encroachment of political religion, and it implements an equilibrium between conflicting rights. Citizens have a right to services, civil services, without having religious symbols pushed on them by state agents. And so banning religious symbols is a small restriction on the freedom of religious expression of the employee, and in particular teachers, and in order to protect the freedom of conscience of users, and especially of children in schools, where it's very important that teachers not display partisan symbols. There are examples of similar bans of religious symbols in many countries. France, Geneva, parts of Germany, Quebec, there's a law, Bill 21. There are many countries, including several Muslim majority countries, that ban face coverings. In Morocco, there's even a law banning the fabrication of burqas. Can't even manufacture them. But I want to talk about one particular ban that's really interesting in France, which goes further than many bans in other countries. Pupils in public schools are banned from wearing religious symbols, and have been since 1994. And they have observed a major improvement in the the academic performance of daughters from Muslim families, which has not been observed among boys, among sons from Muslim families or daughters from other families, because they've been freed from the hijab. The hijab is a very restricting piece of, it's more than a piece of clothing. It's a symbol of a religious movement, a very obscurantist religious movement, and it's a form of religious segregation. So having been freed from that, it's had a very beneficial effect on daughters from Muslim families. And notice I call them daughters from Muslim families, and I don't call them Muslim girls, because children do not have a religion, in my opinion. Now, one of the problems is that religious expression is often given a higher priority than political expression, and it should not be. In Quebec, there's a bill that imposes religious neutrality on civil servants, and it's led to an enormous amount of hostility and opposition. But there's also a Public Service Act, which has been on the books much longer, which imposes political neutrality on civil servants in Quebec, and nobody objects to that. They only object to imposing religious neutrality. Religion gets a free ride. In the neighboring province of Ontario, a judge was disciplined for wearing a MAGA hat in court, as he should be. It was just a dumb joke, but it was not. It was a very inappropriate joke. And nobody objects to requiring political neutrality. Similarly, at the federal level, and I assume you have similar laws in Australia, political neutrality is demanded of civil servants, as it is in Quebec. Nobody objects to that. There was a recent court decision in Illinois concerning restrictions on gatherings during the pandemic. And the restriction has a religious exception. And the court decided that that exception could not be extended to political gatherings. It's for religious gatherings only. Once again, religion gets a free ride. Religion gets privileged treatment. So this is religious expression given a privilege over political expression. Now, religious practice often must be limited. It should be limited in some situations. And here are some examples from a particular field, child protection. Children need to be protected from those who would teach creationism in school or deny them blood transfusions or other health care because of the parents' religion, or deprive them of music because of the parents' religion. This has happened in Montreal. Or would impose Ramadan on children, periodic fasting because of the parents' religion, impose the veil on young girls, or tolerate corporal punishment based on the parents' religion. You may have heard of Yasmin Mohammed's book, Unveiled, where she talks about her experience growing up in a very fundamentalist Muslim family in Canada. And she was beaten severely by her stepfather, and she went to the authorities and eventually went to court. And the judge said, "Oh, no, we can't do anything about it because that's the way you people discipline your children." In other words, religion gets a free ride again. Because it's a religion, nobody is willing to take measures to restrain it. One of the most serious weapons used against secularism is to conflate race with religion. This is when innate immutable attributes like race are conflated with an acquired changeable attribute like religious affiliation. This is of course false. A religious group is not a race. But what this does is it essentializes religious identity as if it were immutable and could not be changed, as if it were a life sentence, as if you were forced to remain a member of a religion you happen to be born in, whether you wanted to or not. And it allows enemies of secularism to make specious accusations of racism. And it's usually it's a key strategy of Islamists and their allies, and they often throw in accusations of Islamophobia at the same time. They associate Islamophobia with racism and use the two together. And it's a return to multi-tribalism, which is often called multiculturalism, which is a euphemism, which sounds really nice, but in practice, what multiculturalism means is multi-tribalism or cultural relativism, where different people from different backgrounds are treated differently, like the example I just gave of Yasmin Mohammed, who was where the courts refused to protect her from the violence of her stepfather. And this conflation of race with religion, it dovetails with the Islamic taboo on apostasy. The apostasy meaning changing your religion. In Islam, it's a horrible sin to leave Islam. So like being a Muslim is a life sentence. And this is, of course, totally incompatible with the concept of freedom of conscience, which is one of the key aspects of secularism. And ironically, if you consider that disparaging a religion is racist, if you make this conflation, then the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all extremely racist if you insist on making this conflation. Judaism says that the Hebrews are the chosen people. of God. Christianity says that if you don't accept Jesus Christ, then you deserve to spend eternity in hell. And Islam in the Quran often promotes violence against non-Muslims, and sometimes even promotes death for non-Muslims. So if you want to, if criticism, if hostility towards a religion or criticism of a religion is considered to be a form of racism, then all three of those religions are very racist. Such conflation has been used to claim that Quebec Bill 21 would lead to genocide, which is absurd. There have been attempts to link the murder of George Floyd to Bill 21, which is just as absurd. George Floyd was the black man who was killed when being arrested in, I think it was in the state of Minnesota. And of course, there's no link to a secularism bill in Quebec. It was a case of racism in a foreign country. There's no link, but people tried to weaponize it as a weapon against secular legislation in Quebec. Bill 21 in Quebec has been challenged before the courts. It's still before the courts. And in the first leg of that, when it was challenged in Quebec Superior Court, the judge ruled that banning religious symbols violates the soul or essence of the believer, but it's okay to ban political symbols. Once again, a free ride for religion and placing it above and more protected than other considerations. There's been an enormous hostility to Quebec secular legislation outside Quebec. The ex-premier of the province of Alberta said racism has become law. Of course, that's nonsense. It has nothing to do with race. And even if you set aside the fake racism issue, as we must, there are some people who still claim, well, Bill 21 discriminates on the basis of religion, but no, it does not. It applies to all religions. It does not discriminate. So there are a lot of false accusations that are put out. I consider the current anti-racist movement to be neo-racist. It promotes racism. It sees racism almost everywhere, except where it really exists sometimes. It tends to be anti-universalist. It values personal identities, especially racial ones above all else. It offers no clear definition of racism, which simply facilitates accusations, slanderous accusations of racism. It conflates race with religion, as I've explained, so that being a Muslim becomes a racial identity, which is nonsense. There is an anti-European bias, so there is anti-white racism, but there's also racism against everybody else because this movement tends to see certain common virtues like objectivity or punctuality or as being white or something, which is insulting for everybody else. It's like saying that people who aren't white can't be objective and punctual or something. It's a common attitude among so-called anti-racists. It's mainly an American phenomenon, this anti-racist movement. It exports the American model to other countries. So there's an overwhelming obsession with anti-Black racism in particular. And this is understandable in the American context, but it's not necessarily appropriate for other countries where racism does not have the same profile. Where, for example, in countries where slavery was never a major part of the economy, then anti-Black racism is not as strong, because after all, the reason racism in the USA was so strong against Blacks was because of money. It was because of slavery. It was because people had vested interests to make tons of money. Racism was profitable. And another problem with the neo-racist movement is they have a monolithic view of each identity group. They fail to understand or recognize conflicts within a group. And I give two examples here. Muslims. The greatest persecution of Muslims is by other Muslims. That is as a result of Islamic dogma. That's the worst part about the most severe persecution of Muslims is from more pious ones. We're trying to get them to be more fundamentalist. The problem is not coming from non-Muslims. And also, this is very much in the Canadian context. Since neo-racists, they fail to see the possibility of racism against those who are so-called white. Well, within Canada, there's throughout Canadian history, a strong prejudice against French-speaking Canadians on the part of English-speaking Canadians. And that is very important currently, because that attitude of bigotry against French speakers is used against Quebec, because it's in Quebec, which is French-speaking, where secularism is making the most progress. And Islamists make full use of this idea that, oh, the Quebecers are xenophobic or racist, and it's a racist attitude against Quebecers that they are putting into practice in their campaign against secularism. So summing up the what I've been saying about race and racism. There's classical racism, we all know, which sees classical European racism, which sees Europe is the center of the universe and all things civilized come from Europe. Neo-racists take the opposite approach and tend to say that everything from Europe is evil. They're both Eurocentric, whereas real anti-racism is universalist. It doesn't value or denigrate monolithically. Classical racism tends to exaggerate biological differences. Neo-racists ignore biological differences and leave race undefined, giving them full reins to use it as an accusation wherever they want. Whereas in reality, we know that race is a biological phenomenon, but genetic variations among humans are so small that we're all, not only are we all part of the same species, we're all part of the same subspecies. So any concept of race is very, very minor. We have much more in common than separate us, like skin color or small genetic differences. Classic racism is based on tribalism. Neo-racism is based on multi-tribalism, rationalized by postmodernism. Whereas anti-racism is universalist and tends towards color blindness. And when I say color blind, I don't mean never seeing race, or a racial identity. But racial identity is not considered important. It's just one attribute of a person's identity, whereas neo-racists elevate race to be like the most important thing of all, and it's not. It's just one more part of a person's identity. Their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their gender, their nationality, their education. It's one of many attributes of a human being. To distinguish between secularism and anti-secularism, this is very important because, because of the strength of anti-secular campaigns in Canada, reacting to Quebec's secular legislation, Bill 21. If one opposes all bans on religious symbols and face coverings everywhere, then that is anti-secular, because that means giving highest priority to religious symbols over other considerations. It makes uniforms impossible for those jobs which normally would require uniforms. If you oppose any ban on religious symbols, then you've got to have a special uniform for Muslim women and another uniform for Sikhs or whatever, and it's never ending. To racialize religious affiliation, to conflate race with religion, is anti-secular because it's incompatible with freedom of conscience, as I've explained. The use of Islamophobia as an accusation similar to racism, that's also anti-secular for reasons similar to the previous point. And as a general rule, when religious rules are valued above civil law, you've got anti-secularism. And in Canada, there are a number of organizations which claim to be secular, but which oppose secularism in the one place in Canada where it's making the greatest progress. These are two of them. Now, a particularly extreme example of the collaboration, the alliance, de facto alliance between Islamism and neo-racism is a course to combat so-called Islamophobia given by the Muslim Association of Canada, and which received government funding to set up a video course against Islamophobia. And it's replete with neo-racist jargon. For example, they talk about anti-Muslim white nationalist terrorism, intersectional Islamophobia, whiteness, Orientalism, anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim racism, patriarchy, and imperialism. Another example that's not in the slide, they say that to insult the Prophet Muhammad is a microaggression. Oh, here it is, yes. The microaggression is a favorite buzzword of neo-racists. They claim that several Canadian security agents have Islamophobic policies. What this would mean if those so-called Islamophobic policies were banned, that would mean that they would no longer have the power to take security measures to work against infiltration by Islamist agents, which is a real world concern. And one of my favorites here is the way the course weaponizes First Nations culture, Native Canadian culture against secularism. The course praises non-secular ways of knowing and being and doing, such as the Indigenous ways, thus setting up using the culture of Native Canadians as an excuse to give privileges to Islam. Basically, that's what it amounts to. The fact that this video course received government funding is evidence of gross incompetence in the government, a total failure to think critically. These are a number of organizations in Canada that have come out against Bill 21, and I've mentioned a couple of organizations which are claimed to be secular, but they tend to conflate race and religion. There's even a humanist organization on the west coast of Canada that says that Bill 21 would harm people of color, which is complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with race or skin color. It's about religious symbols worn by people on the job in certain jobs. The supporters of Quebec Bill 21, all Quebec secular organizations support it. And until recently, there were no secular or so-called secular organizations in Canada outside Quebec which supported it. One exception, fortunately, recently, as of a couple of weeks ago, one organization in Ontario came out in support of Bill 21. This is 4 years after the law's adoption in 2019. Only one organization. And this is an illustration of the disconnect between the two models of secularism. The fact that almost nobody in the so-called secular organizations outside Quebec support this bill, but all organizations within Quebec do. Interveners before the courts. These three organizations, this is the organization I work with. We intervened before Quebec Superior Court in support of Bill 21. Now the law is before Quebec, the Quebec Court of Appeal, and after that, it will almost certainly go to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I wanted to thank the Secular Association of New South Wales, who made a very generous donation to our legal fund when we were before Quebec Superior Court in favor of Bill 21. This is a court case that was brought by opponents trying to get Bill 21 struck down. So far, only a couple of parts of it have been struck down because the law was constructed well enough that it was difficult for the judge to do any more damage. But he wanted to strike down the whole law, but was unable to. However, other courts, we don't know what, we still haven't got the decision from the Quebec Court of Appeal, and then we don't know what the Canadian Supreme Court will do. So to conclude almost, here's how I would define secularism. 4 points. Equality of citizens, including female-male equality, protection of freedom of conscience, religious neutrality of the state, and that would be strong religious neutrality. That is not just neutrality among religions, but neutrality between the religious and the non-religious as well. And finally, the separation principle, which is crucial because without it, the other three are weakened. And in conclusion, universalism is an Enlightenment value. It's fundamental to the political left and must be defended. Freedom of conscience is fundamental. Freedom of religion is not. Freedom of conscience includes freedom of religious belief and non-belief and freedom of thought and political opinion, other things. The secularism principle is, the separation principle rather, is very important to secularism. Political Islam is an extreme right-wing movement allied with neo-racism. The criminalization of apostasy is nothing less than barbaric. Apostasy means changing one's religion. It's a horrific sin according to fundamentalist Islam, and there are several Muslim majority countries where apostasy is illegal and may even be punished by death. And I would emphasize that children have no religion. It's unacceptable to identify children with the religion of their parents, let them do their thing until they reach maturity, until they become adults, and then they will choose to have whatever religion or none, whatever they want. And suggested reading on our website, there's a manifesto for universalism, and which is a very important document we adopted a few months ago. And this, as I mentioned earlier, my book, Stillbirth, The Failure of Secularism in the English-Speaking World, is I explore these issues in some detail, the issues that I've presented to you here today. So that is my talk. Thank you. I will leave this on the screen and stop sharing. And so back to you, David Miller.
Good. Well, thank you, David Rand, for your talk on secularism.